Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about how the US or how the globalists use the power of the United States economically, culturally, and politically to force globalization on all the countries of the West, all the white countries of the West, to force globalization and its program upon them, even though they were unwilling to do it. The people of those places didn't vote for it or want it or ask for it, and that the policies and processes of globalization were forced on a people in direct defiance of their wishes. And the power of the United States, again, economically, politically, and culturally, was used to do this. Now, and I'll give some examples in a minute, but should therefore, given that the power of the US was used, the United States was used to force globalization on unwilling countries and on populations that didn't want it, should now the power of the US with President Trump or the administration of President Trump, should they use the United States, the power of the United States, to unwind globalization? And that's the sort of question I'm positing in this essay. Now, I'll mention a few things I've mentioned in other videos, but when you look at the power of the US, what was one of the first things that they did, American troops, when they went into Iraq and entered Baghdad? Was it to reconnect the electricity supply? Was it to get the water running again? Was it to make sure there were police on the streets to keep order? Were there protection of museums so they didn't get looted? Were there protection of administrative buildings and all sorts of things? Were they watching out for terrorists that might run around and set off fire? What was their priority? Well, no, their key priorities were, within minutes of entering Baghdad, were to do things like setting up a lesbian counselling service, to set up a women's refuge for the to fight the oppression of women. It was to set up colleges to teach gender studies, and to set up lesbian painting classes. It was all sorts of things to do with creating social division along religious, racial, gender, and lines of sexuality. I mean, the first thing you do is set up a lesbian counselling service or gay lesbian counselling service in a country you've just invaded. I mean, seriously? Well, why wouldn't you want to get the electricity on and the water running again? Isn't that something? So this is part of the globalist, imperialist, social restructuring program, and the power of the US state in this, coupled with military in this instance, was used ruthlessly for this effect. What happened when the American forces entered Kabul in Afghanistan, in a deeply tribal Islamic religious society? What's one of the first things they did? Set up a lesbian counselling service, set up gay lesbian this and the lesbian painting classes, start schools and send girls to gender studies class. This was the first things they did. So clearly there was a globalist, again, the social, racial. Now they can say, oh, we're only for equality. That's bullshit. They're attempting to destabilize that society. Well, whether or not you agree with the way the Islamic society like Afghanistan is run, that's a separate issue again. To go in and deliberately try and undermine that society by doing what will piss them off the most, what is guaranteed to annoy them the most. Let's do that. That will undermine their society. Let's go to the heart of what society is, and let's fill it full of angry lesbians and feminists. So there were lesbian counsellors and feminist counsellors climbing all over the place, whether they were used as a back channel through NGOs or directly in government employ, US government employ. It hardly matters, but the globalist program was being forced on them. Now the society didn't want it. It wasn't helpful to society like theirs. It's simply not advanced. It's a tribal, it's a Stone Age society with guns. That's what it is. So now, and I've mentioned this several times before, but I was taking a flight I was in the US on business. I was taking a flight. I think it was from New York to Dallas or maybe Miami or something like that. And so the guy said, just so happens in the business class, or the guy sitting next to me was a guy from one of the Caribbean islands, and he was the son of one of the mafia goons that run the island. But they'd gone to New York to, I think it was New York. They'd gone to New York to discuss a trade agreement with the US government. And apparently there was like a United Nations people there as well. But so now this island depends on, I think it was they grew some crop like sugar or something like that. And the US bought their sugar crop at highly inflated prices, by the way. And also American cruise ships would stop at the island, and they were getting, a couple of cruise ships a day, and that would disgorge lots of cashed up American tourists to spend money in, the hotels. So the tourist industry and buying their sugar was really the only two things they had, and they were very poor island economies. This guy who was probably about my age, I guess, so he'd have been, I don't know, at the time maybe late 20s, and he was part of this trade mission, this trade negotiating mission, and he had this sort of quite bewildered look on his face, like he couldn't get his head around it. And he said all they wanted to talk about is the American trade people. He said they didn't want to talk about trade at all. Trade didn't even get mentioned. They threatened the island with, we won't buy your sugar anymore. We can cut off the cruise ships. We can screw your economy totally unless you do what we say. And what we want you to do is, you've got to set up a divorce court. You've got to set up, child support agency with lots of powers to arbitrarily go and chase people. You've got to set up, gay lesbian counselling services. You have to fly pride flags from the well, not pride flags. I don't know whether but they were forcing a gay, lesbian, feminist agenda. You have to have gender studies classes in university. You have to have more women going to university. They were forcing a lot of social change that had nothing to do with trade, but they were using the power of the US economy to force it on. Now, this is an impoverished island, in the middle of the Caribbean. Who gives a shit if they've got lesbian dance classes at the university? Who gives a shit? But this was viewed as critically important by the US to force the sort of globalization, social type change that they wanted. So they were re-engineering the society of this little island in the middle of nowhere. They were re-engineering the society of this island along feminist, race hustle agenda, or gender and LGBTQ hustling lines, and I was surprised by that at the time. I didn't really know as much about the globalist program back then, so it struck me as odd. Why would they do that? Now, I subsequently heard and saw. So when I was reading, the newspapers, and this is sort of really pre the internet really kicking off, reading newspapers and magazines about how the American trade negotiators spoke about social equity in this country or that country or this or that, and I thought, okay, this really comes back to what that guy from that Caribbean island was saying, that the Americans are using trade and finance, and we'll cause a run on your currency if you don't do what we want. We'll slap tariffs on you. We'll stop cruise ships from arriving. We'll screw your economy totally unless you do what the fuck we tell you to do. And the Americans, are the vanguard. We represent the globalization project. We're going to use the power of the United States to force the globalist project on. Now, the United States has the economic power, even more so then than now. But say at the time it was like 22, 23% of the world economy. So you couldn't really operate outside of the orbit of the United States, wider financial infrastructure. The dollar being the reserve currency just in itself was a big issue, still is a big issue. So they could go to places like Britain Germany and France and all that sort of thing, and say, look, you will do this, and if you don't, then we're going to punish you for it using the power of the United States, um, financially and otherwise. We're going to punish you for that. Now, if you look at the amount of spending the US did on defence in Europe, for example, the European countries were taking a very junior partnership role in that. Now, why did that happen? My understanding of that is that, if you don't, set up lesbian painting classes in every city in Germany or Britain, if you don't agree to mass migration, if you don't take shitloads of third world illiterate peasants, we're going to make you pay billions upon billions more in defence, or we're going to, put tariffs on you, or we're going to do, whatever, but using the power of the US to force global. No country wanted mass migration. Um, and if you get a politician to talk privately and they know you're not recording it or something like that, they don't want it either. But it seems they're being forced to do it. But by what? What unseen force is behind the curtain here, strong arming them into doing the mass migration thing, to ensuring that there are lesbian dance theory classes, all across universities, that there are thousands of sociology courses teaching hatred of the West and so on. Why is all this happening? How is it happening? And why is it happening uniformly and in tandem and in concert and seemingly coordinated centrally, happening all across the Western world? Um, so this is the US. The globalists took the US first, then used the power of the US to force these changes on the rest of the world when the world didn't want it. Now, the price we all paid for that is that these Western governments all became puppets of the globalists. And the difference between representative government that represents the people, the electorate and its wishes, or supposedly, or an elected government, a pretend puppet government, although elected by the people, that only represents the globalists. The difference between the two, the government that represents the people or the government that represents the globalists, even though technically they're both being voted and elected in, the difference between the two is vast. It's a chasm. It's broader than the Grand Canyon, so wider than the Grand Canyon. So this is how the US used its power to force other Western countries, particularly the white English-speaking diaspora, particularly them, but others too, into going along with what was the global and is the globalist project. Now, President Trump has just as the US used its power to force globalization on countries, President Trump is now in a position to use US power to unwind the globalization. The question is, should he do it? Is it desirable? And as using US power to force globalization was an abuse of power, would forcing an unwinding of globalization be abuse of power? For example, let's say, okay, British government, I know you only represent the globalists, so don't pretend you represent the people you don't. And I'm going to slap a 25% or a 50%, slap tariffs on all British goods and make finance harder for, I'm going to make life difficult for you unless you, A, stop mass migration, two, that you send all these people back to anyone convicted of criminal, that you evict masses of these third world peasants you've brought in. You stop all hatred courses teaching hatred of white society. The power of the US could do that, and the British would just have to go along with it. It wouldn't be like they would have an option. And so, should the US, and that's crudely represented, by the way, in what I've just said, but should the US use its power to do that? And the Trump administration probably will only get a short window on doing this if they, assuming they want to do it. I mean, they've got enough internal issues to deal with, for goodness sakes. But while they're there, this could be the huge turning point in unwinding and preventing the hugely corrosive and destructive effects of globalization on the Western world. We have a central part of which is the absolute crushing of our living standards. President Trump's administration could reverse this, and I, for one, hope they do. You've been Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.